Now, today I want to talk about a very serious subject, about being ugly and the consequences of being ugly. Now, I'm not talking about ugly versus beautiful. I'm not talking about ugly like an ugly toad or frog. Apologies to the toads and frogs. I'm talking about ugly in terms of behavior, attitude, approach, in the context of leadership, authority, power, and influence, particularly as it pertains to crossing boundaries and interacting or working with other groups. And these days, this is very important because so many of the problems, the adaptive challenges that we face, are complicated, multifaceted, multidimensional challenges that require more than one group, often multiple groups, to address them. So to do leadership work, you have to cross boundaries, build bridges, and generate connections that support problem solving and collaborative work. And you don't want to be seen as ugly as you go about that work, nor do you want your behavior, your approach, to trigger an ugly group dynamic. Because in the world today, when it comes to leadership, bad leadership, there is a lot of ugliness. There are people who think they are providing leadership or being agents of positive change, but they are actually contributing to the fractures and divisions and problems that are abundant in this crazy world. Now, as a way to explain the nature of this leadership challenge, let me tell you about the book, The Ugly American. That's why I've titled this video, The Ugly American, because of the book. The book, it was actually a novel. It was written in 1958 by two people. One, a former American Foreign Service officer, William Lederer, and the other, a political scientist, Eugene Burdick. They co-authored the novel, and it quickly became a bestseller. And in 1963, it was turned into a movie starring the most famous actor in America at the time, Marlon Brando. Yes, Marlon Brando starred in this movie, and you've probably never heard of it. Very briefly, the story is about a Southeast Asian country that has a growing nationalist movement that is seeking to rid the country of foreign interference and influence, and to fight for political independence. In the movie, Brando plays the role of the U.S. ambassador, who struggles to do the right thing because the U.S. government has its own agenda. And that agenda is not consistent with the aspirations of the people of this Asian country. For Brando, the ambassador, he senses what the important work needs to be, such as generating political connections, identifying the aspirations of the people, understanding the values and perspectives of the different groups and factions that make up the country, and figuring out how best to help. Now, he has some important connections to key people in the nationalist movement, and he listens to them. So he appreciates their concerns and their hopes. He understands what they are fighting for. But he cannot give overt support because that would go against U.S. policy. In a way, he is trapped in his role. He is an ambassador and beholden to his political masters back in Washington, and he is expected to do what his government tells him to do. But he knows there are serious flaws in the Washington strategy. He tries to influence Washington to get them to modify their positions, but they won't budge. The government, the senators, the Congress, they are stuck in a Cold War mentality, and they believe that many of the politicians and the activists of this country are communists and up to no good. And by virtue of these beliefs, their policies, many mistakes are made. Now, the story is about arrogance, ignorance, hubris, insensitivity, flawed perspectives, all those things. Thus the title, The Ugly American. Now, what's extraordinary is that the book was written before the Vietnam War, foreshadowing exactly what would unfold. When the book came out, a young U.S. senator was so impressed with it that he took out a full-page ad in the New York Times promoting the book. That senator was John F. Kennedy, who 2 years later became President of the United States. He also sent the book to every member of Congress, telling them that they had to read it. He saw the book as a wake-up call. Kennedy believed that the novel exposed serious flaws in American diplomacy and development efforts. And by distributing the book to members of Congress, he hoped to galvanize support for smarter, more strategic, more empathic foreign engagement. Now, in fact, the book's influence contributed to the creation of the Peace Corps when Kennedy became president. And the Peace Corps embodied, and continues to embody, the ideals of cultural understanding and grassroots development promoted in the novel. Anyway, the book spent more than a year on the New York Times bestseller list. Very impressive. It's not a great literary work. It's not like reading Hemingway or Tolstoy. No, what's important about the book is the message. Now, I'm not going to talk further about the book. You can read it for yourself. It's a good read. Or you can see the movie, and it's a fun movie, and Brando is excellent. What I want to talk about is the dangers of becoming ugly, an ugly authority figure, and someone that fosters or contributes to the emergence of an ugly group. As I said before, there's always people who think they are doing leadership work, but they are actually ugly authority figures or change agents of some sort who represent a particular faction or champion a particular set of concerns or fight for a particular cause. And in doing so, they pursue divisive strategies. They inflame the situation. They make matters worse. So let's explore this dynamic of ugliness in the context of leadership, authority, and group behavior. As we all know, authority figures are influential in shaping group norms and spotlighting problems. They frame the work that needs to be done. They put attention on an issue. If they get it wrong, you can waste time and resources. They can generate negative outcomes. If they get it right, good for them. The group advances. A problem is brought to resolution. But as an authority figure, their behavior, what they can and cannot do, is also shaped by the prevailing group norms. It's an interactive reinforcing dynamic between the authority figure and the group. For example, an ugly group can choose someone to represent them, and that person in turn becomes an ugly authority figure, like a gang leader or a mafia boss. But even good people, people with noble intentions, shall we say, under the right set of circumstances, they can stir the latent, ugly sentiments in a group, and that group may end up doing terrible things. One reason for that might be the amount of conformity in the system that reduces the problem-solving capacity of the group, the inability to deal with complex challenges, which necessitate the engagement of diverse perspectives. And an ugly authority figure is inclined to surround themselves with people that reinforce and perpetuate ugly behavior. If the big guy encourages nastiness or rewards cruelty or mocks others or punishes dissent, those behaviors can easily become normalized. People think it's okay to do those things. And to get ahead, to be seen as a member of the in-group, to rise in the hierarchy, certain members will ingratiate themselves to the alpha. Like little chimpanzees wanting to get ahead, to be accepted. They constantly ingratiate themselves to the dominant alpha chimp, scratching his back. And members who don't scratch the alpha's back, those who challenge the status quo, or challenge the authority figure, or raise objections to his or her strategies, they risk being ostracized, marginalized, humiliated, kicked out, or even killed off. This produces conformity, but it also generates a climate of fear. And of course, in this kind of environment, rigorous questioning is discouraged and critical thinking is replaced by compliance and obedience. And in such an environment, you actually reduce the problem-solving capacities and the creative capacities of the people. But paradoxically, there can be an energy here, a momentum. The dark forces are stirred, and the supporting faction, that group that authorizes the alpha, they get excited, energized, often buying into a fantasy, an illusion that this person is going to make their lives better, make the group great again. Now, the authority figure harnesses the discontent. He amplifies it. And the group, they attribute to him or her a certain amount of charisma. Indeed, ugly groups often have charismatic leaders, authority figures, who with their gift of the gab, their language, their style, they know how to stir the sentiment of the group. They know what buttons to press. They know how to charm, even seduce. This tactic boosts loyalty and support, even generates a group fervor, but the ugly element here is that it often fosters prejudice and paranoia. It can elicit the group's ugliness, stir that ugliness, and lead to wasteful battles. Now, a very important point. An ugly group with an ugly authority figure essentially avoids facing reality and dealing with the real problem or set of issues. They avoid the work, the real work, the important work that must be addressed in order to progress. They blame others. They create phantom issues, decoy issues. They do anything but take responsibility and face reality and do the heavy lifting of problem solving, innovation, and adaptive work. Instead of putting attention on the adaptive work, the ugly group puts the attention on the ugly authority figure to fight the phantom issue. So let's unravel this dynamic a little further, how ugliness emerges and is manifest. And I'll focus on 4 points: projection, negative stereotyping, moral rationalization, and group narcissism. My first point, projection. Ugliness often emerges when a group is under stress, feels besieged, or is struggling with complexity. They've hit some kind of a wall and they're not advancing in a way that they would like. When such is the case, what happens is the psychological dynamic of projection. For example, if you're dealing with a difficult problem, the risk is that the complexity overwhelms people, so the authority figure simplifies the problem by externalizing it, projecting blame or responsibility onto another group. It's their fault. They are the cause of our woes. Now, when a problem is complex and messy, it can be overwhelming for any group. We all struggle with complexity and we all like simple solutions. And we all prefer to blame others rather than take responsibility for our woes. It's a very human characteristic. But the ugly dynamic is, when it is triggered, what happens is that the group regresses to an immature state, where they suspend critical thinking and responsibility and rely on the authority figure to guide them by simplifying a complex problem, giving them an easy answer, and telling them what they need to do or who they need to blame. And a feature of projection is scapegoating. When anxious or frustrated, the group projects their negative sentiment onto a convenient target. They scapegoat. They blame someone or a group who's not truly at fault. They may be partially at fault, but not completely so. And this is a way to relieve pressure, anxiety, avoid accountability, and to unite the group against a common enemy. And it's very interesting to look at this term, scapegoat. In The Golden Bough, it's a book on mythology and magic by Sir James George Fraser. I think it was written in 1897, but it's a classic that is still studied today, The Golden Bough. He talks a lot about the practice of scapegoating and how in ancient Greece and Rome, scapegoating was a ritual where a community's negative aspects were loaded onto a scapegoat, a person or an animal, which was then expelled or killed to cleanse the community. And he gives the example of how in Rome a man would be taken into the town square, beaten and then driven out of the town. This was done to represent the old year being expelled to make way for the new. It's like a purification process. And we still scapegoat today. It's a feature of ugly groups. Hannah Arendt, a great historian and philosopher, she has written extensively about this in the context of ugly group behavior. I encourage you to read her material, Hannah Arendt. She passed away in the 1970s, but she was a frontline witness, we might say, to the communist revolutions, World War I and II, and the rise of Nazism. And as an academic, she wrestled with these big questions pertaining to how do ugly authority figures and ugly groups emerge. She noted too that these characters offer simple solutions and a consistent narrative or storyline with enemies and scapegoats and dangers and threats everywhere, and that generates a paranoia that people act on. And the followers become excessively dependent on the dominant authority figure for sense-making and guidance, and the most ardent supporters, they seem to have, in her words, a contempt for factuality, for dealing with truth, with reality. They become crusaders, non-thinking adherents to the doctrine, to the story, to the mission, to the cause. And that leads to my second point, stereotyping and demonizing. A way to avoid dealing with complexity or reality is to simplify your understanding or interpretation of the other, to stereotype other groups. Stereotyping is essentially making whopping, incomplete generalizations about other groups. We all stereotype. But the problem is when those stereotypes are negative and acted upon as if true, definitively true. For example, they are lazy, they are dangerous, they are up to no good, they are a threat. They'll never be like us, so we need to avoid them, vilify them, or even neutralize them. Now, when the stereotype is rigid or dogmatic, it reduces critical thinking and people cannot see nuance. The stereotype is like a fog. It reduces your capacity to see clearly. And when such is the case, and the attributions about the other are very adverse and inflexible, it can ignite ugly behavior. And when you demonize the other group, attribute to them all sorts of dreadful things, particularly in a heightened state of anxiety, it can be like a contagion. It can spread like wildfire and get out of control very fast. It can start fights or riots. It can even start wars. At a minimum, it can lead to groups being suspicious of the other and refusing to collaborate or share resources. And this leads to my third point, moral rationalization. Moral rationalization is the psychological process of justifying immoral behavior, bad behavior, by reinterpreting it as morally acceptable, as okay. It allows the group to maintain a positive self-image while engaging in actions that are harmful and conflict with their espoused moral standards. Moral rationalization is essentially moral disengagement. Moral reasoning or concern for the other, doing the right thing, goes out the door. There is little empathy for the other group and a significant degree of self-righteousness. Even though the authority figure or the group might do something terrible, by any standard, it is rationalized or justified. It's okay because we are the good guys. Our heart is in the right place. Our mission is noble. And this leads to my fourth point, another feature of how ugliness emerges. And that is group narcissism. Actually, you can see how all this leads to a group narcissism, an inflated sense of self-importance. We are superior, the other is inferior. And given that, the authority figure and the group, they frame issues as us versus them, good guys versus bad guys, like a John Wayne cowboy movie. Now, many years ago, I remember having a talk in my office at Harvard with a U.S. general. In fact, he had been the chief of staff of the U.S. Army, the top dog, a very good man. But the way he talked about Iraq and Afghanistan was good guys and bad guys. Everything was good guys and bad guys. This was at the very beginning of the war, a war that was justified based on a false premise. Now, of course, there are bad actors in the world, and good guys, bad guys might make sense from time to time depending on the circumstance. My point is, don't let that way of framing impede your capacity to see clearly, to see yourself clearly, to see your group clearly, and to see the work that needs to be done with clarity. Now, I think that way of thinking is very tribal in a way, good tribe, bad tribe, and the tribal impulse is alive and well in all groups, in all of us. That's how we have survived since time immemorial in small tribes or a network of tribes that form alliances. And we've always been suspicious of other groups. Are they friend or foe? What are they up to? So biologically, I think the impulse, that instinct is there in our DNA. There's something wonderful about it as well because it can contribute to strong teams, group identity, and a sense of community. But this impulse becomes ugly when the group, the people, they have an exaggerated sense of who they are and demand recognition or compliance from others. There's a certain degree of grandiosity there. Look at me, look at us, listen to us. We know what is good for you. We dictate the terms. It can lead to a craving for recognition, approval, praise, or validation from outsiders. And when others don't bow down and they don't comply with your wishes, that can lead to hostility, resentment, threats, aggression. Things can get very ugly very fast. So the point here is that the projections, the stereotyping, the moral rationalization, the group's narcissistic tendencies can lead to ugly behavior, ugly dynamics, where the important work, the problem-solving work, the creative work, the bridge-building work, the collaborative work to address adaptive challenges is neglected. Now, I should mention that this isn't just my group versus your group ugliness. Any group can splinter, break apart, and unleash toxic forces that can potentially destroy the group, an internal scapegoating dynamic. You guys are not committed enough. You're not pure enough. You don't wave the flag high enough. So the ugliness is manifest in the form of scapegoating internal members in order to purify the larger group and intensify the group commitment or loyalty, or at least the appearance of it. For example, the Cultural Revolution in China in the 1960s and 70s. An extreme example, but very illustrative of what I'm talking about. This was a decade-long social and political movement initiated by Mao to preserve communist ideology by purging remnants of capitalist and traditional elements from Chinese society. I mean, I watched this on the news as a kid and I was shocked by what I saw. And since then, I've studied it in great depth. Basically, what happened was that they, the people, turned on their own. Mao, his henchmen, the Gang of Four led by Mao's wife, created and encouraged a youth movement to rid the system, the schools, local government, the larger society, of people who were not pure enough in their overt commitment to the movement, to the teachings of Mao. The students, I mean, these are high school students and university students, young people. They formed these militant groups called Red Guards who attacked intellectuals, teachers, educators, administrators, government officials. They destroyed cultural artifacts and persecuted those they deemed as enemies of the revolution. Schools and universities were shut down and tens of thousands of people were subjected to public humiliation. They lost their jobs, many were imprisoned or sent to labor camps or re-education camps, and many were beaten up, tortured, or even killed. Now, the Cultural Revolution was very ugly in every sense. It had a small network of ugly authority figures who stirred the dark forces that produced a very ugly group dynamic. It's very scary. Educated, intelligent, smart people can become ugly very easily given the right set of circumstances. There's a leadership lesson here. You really need to be aware of these forces, dynamics, and tendencies, because it's very easy to slide into ugliness, particularly in times of stress or when dealing with complex issues, or when you are not advancing fast enough or to the degree that you would want, or you were promised. Germany did that in the 1930s and 40s. As you know, Hitler tapped into that discontent. He expressed that discontent. He attributed blame to the other and offered a solution for going forward. He gained informal authority, the movement gained momentum, and he was granted formal authority to run the whole country, to enact his agenda. He was an ugly authority figure for an ugly group that scapegoated others and perpetuated the avoidance of the real problems that needed to be addressed in order to produce substantial, sustainable, shared progress. Hitler was a bad person, but good people with good intentions can also be ugly and do ugly things when it comes to leadership work. Let me give you a more contemporary example of that. This is illustrative of how it emerges when the adaptive work requires you engage multiple groups. And this example pertains to the American occupation of Iraq under the governorship of Paul Bremer. After the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, Paul Bremer was appointed the head of the Coalition Provisional Authority. He was the de facto governor of Iraq. He was a seasoned diplomat, a former ambassador, and a Harvard MBA. So he knew how to manage things, but he failed when it came to leadership. He was given the daunting leadership challenge of rebuilding a country torn apart by war. He didn't succeed. Under his stewardship, Iraq descended into chaos, insurgency, and civil war. So what went wrong? Bremer failed to build a network of partners to help him in problem-solving and decision-making, to help navigate the cultural and political terrain, to provide feedback so strategic and judgmental errors could be modified or corrected. What's more, his strategies, unintentionally, ignited ugly group dynamics in those groups, those societal factions opposed to what Bremer and his team were doing. For example, one of Bremer's first moves was to purge all members of Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party from government positions. On paper, it sounded logical, remove the old regime's influence. But in reality, this decision gutted Iraq's bureaucracy. Teachers, doctors, engineers, administrators, many of whom had joined the Ba'ath Party just to keep their jobs, they were suddenly unemployed. Overnight, Iraq lost its administrative backbone. He also dissolved the entire Iraqi military. That meant hundreds of thousands of trained soldiers, many armed, many angry, were left jobless. That created a vacuum in security and fueled the insurgency. Many of these ex-soldiers joined militant groups, including what would become ISIS, Islamic State. And we all know that ISIS was and is, still remains, the ultimate embodiment of ugliness, a vicious group and movement, and their destructive tentacles were not confined to Iraq or Syria, but spread throughout the world. Now, Paul Bremer, I am sure, is a very fine man. This is not a personal attack on his character at all. But from a leadership perspective, his approach had an ugly tinge to it. He operated from the green zone, a fortified bubble in Baghdad. Decisions were made top-down with little input from local authority figures, such as clan leaders, religious authorities, and respected elders. He had few partners. A potential partner that he essentially ignored and marginalized was the United Nations, in particular Sergio de Mello, the UN representative on the ground in Iraq. Sergio de Mello was the most experienced diplomat in the world in regards to nation building, especially in conflict-ridden countries. Paul Bremer, with his instructions from the Bush administration, did not want to share control with the UN. They felt that allowing the UN a larger role might dilute US influence over Iraq's political future. The US favored rapid democratization and market liberalization. The UN advocated a more gradual, locally driven process. And Bremer's sweeping decisions like the de-Baathification and disbanding the Iraqi army, and the choice of particular Iraqis from the diaspora community to come back and be the local authority figures. These decisions were made unilaterally, without UN input, and often contradicted UN advice. Sergio de Mello, the UN representative, could have been an incredibly valuable partner, but he was ignored. His previous assignment was in war-torn East Timor, and before that Kosovo, and before that Cambodia. Many talked about him as a future Secretary General of the United Nations. That's how good and how respected he was. As an aside, I worked in East Timor with their leadership in their transition to becoming a nation after 2 decades of fighting. My job was building leadership capacity and helping them to figure out their adaptive challenges going forward. Anyway, I saw firsthand the outstanding work Sergio de Mello did. In Iraq, the Americans, Paul Bremer, they did not want to work with him. Bremer pushed de Mello away and did not consult him or take his advice. That's ugly. And the great tragedy was that Sergio de Mello was killed in the bombing of the UN headquarters in Baghdad on August 19, 2003. 2 of my former students at Harvard survived the bombing while working for the UN in Iraq. One of those students was Sergio de Mello's fiancée. She held his hand in the rubble for hours until he eventually perished. She was my teaching assistant and shared with me the tragic details of that event. Anyway, the point here is that Paul Bremer's tenure in Iraq is a cautionary tale. It shows how even an experienced executive can fail when they ignore local realities, dismantle institutions without a plan, fail to partner and lead from isolation, ignorance, and self-absorbed arrogance. Now let me wrap this up with some tips, some principles to ensure you don't become ugly or contribute to ugly group behavior. Actually, the reality is we can all fall into the ugly trap. Anybody trying to do leadership work, faced with a daunting challenge, trying to be an agent of positive change, can make errors. When you have to interact with multiple groups and get people to do things that perhaps they don't want to do, it is inevitable that you will step on toes, offend others, generate resistance, or outright opposition. Anyway, my first point is, treat adaptive work, the work of change, the work of leadership, as a learning process, a discovery process. This will help to minimize ugly behavior and ensure you can make effective course corrections along the way. You have to have a process for testing your assumptions, your beliefs, your strategies. You fall into the ugly trap when you have big assumptions about the other group, those people, or have assumptions about what needs to be done, and you strongly believe that your assumptions are correct and in no need of testing. Paul Bremer's case in Iraq is illustrative of that. So approach leadership as a learning process for yourself and help others to learn. Learn about the system, the adaptive challenge, and how one's behavior impedes or contributes to the doing of adaptive work. Principle number 2. Seek to understand the story of the other, the human story. Be interested and be curious, and encourage your people to be interested and curious. That's how you build bridges. Your challenge is to reduce the mystery of the other. And one way of doing that is by understanding their story. All groups have a story about the past, where they came from, their journey, and they have a story about the present, what's important to them in terms of investing time, resources, and energy. And there is also a story about the future, the hope of tomorrow, What are they aiming for? What does progress look like to them? What does success mean? To be effective in your leadership work, you really need some insight into those stories. It brings a very real human element to the people that you are interacting with. And the way you gain that insight is by going to the ground. You hear the real story on the ground. It helps you to appreciate how they see and understand the adaptive challenge or the adaptive work that needs to be done in order to advance. It also helps you to design or to calibrate your interventions, your approach, your strategies to ensure that they are appropriate and relevant for the context. And my third point, a point people don't normally think about. Have a sense of what kind of threat you might be perceived as being to the other group. What do you represent to them? It's not just you, Mr. Nice Guy, showing up to do wonderful things. People don't just see you, but see you as representing or embodying something that is bigger than just you. Embodying values, embodying a history, embodying a culture, embodying an agenda, embodying a role. And that may be perceived as threatening. It's not always easy to know what you represent in terms of a threat. But you should keep that in mind. Be sensitive to it. When you show up, how do people see you? Speak to that. Acknowledge that. When the Americans showed up in Iraq and Afghanistan, for that matter, they were seen as a Western force, predominantly Christian, and were an extension of the old imperialists, people who had been walking over those lands and plundering those lands since Alexander the Great. Your aims might be noble, but if the perception of who you are impedes people's capacity to appreciate what you are trying to do, then they might refuse to cooperate or actively resist. And this connects to my next principle. Have critical partners who can speak honestly, forthrightly, and truthfully to you, and to help you navigate the terrain, and call you on any ugly tendencies. In fact, you need a diverse network of partners. Partners can be anyone who can help you to appreciate the dynamics and forces on the ground and give you direct feedback on your style or approach, and to ensure you don't come across as obnoxious or a menacing character or whatever. You have to be willing to take that feedback and modify your approach and course correct as appropriate. Don't be stubborn. And this leads to my last point or principle. When you make a serious error, things break down or strategies are pursued that lead to negative consequences, ugly outcomes. Take the time to clean up the mess, learn from the errors, and rebuild relationships. You don't want the stain of ugliness, your ugliness, or your group's ugliness, or the perception of ugliness to linger on and on. A great lesson on leadership here is Robert McNamara, the former Secretary of Defense under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. McNamara was the chief decision maker, architect, the primary driver of America's involvement in Vietnam, the Vietnam War, next to the president, of course. 10 years after the war, he went through a period of honest reflection and soul-searching as he tried to understand how he and those he worked with might better have addressed the challenges posed by the conflict, the war in Vietnam. What's interesting in doing that leadership work, adaptive work, he had a series of meetings, 7 of them, with his Vietnamese counterparts to explore what happened, why it happened, and to learn from the mistakes made. The mistakes in perception, assumptions, and strategy, and missed opportunities to end the war earlier. He wrote about this. I also heard him speak on this when he visited the Harvard campus. It was one of the most important presentations on leadership I have ever heard. It wasn't just theoretical. This was the real stuff. This was the big man telling us what he learned and telling us that he made serious mistakes, errors of judgment. He wasn't arrogant, but very thoughtful and humble, very vulnerable. He was very courageous, actually, not an easy thing to do. He acknowledged that the war was a mistake. It should never have been fought. And in his words, we were wrong, terribly wrong, and we owe it to future generations to explain why. Now, the American belief was that they had to contain a monolithic communist menace controlled from the Kremlin or Beijing. That belief was flawed. The Vietnamese were fighting for their independence. In the past, they had been abused by the Chinese, the French, the Japanese, and now the Americans. These were nationalists, not hardcore communists. That's also the story of the book, The Ugly American, that I talked about at the beginning of this presentation. As I said, McNamara had 7 meetings with his counterparts. Each meeting allowed both sides to present and reflect on their beliefs and assumptions and their strategies, and to see what was missed and to ask questions of one another. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. These were very emotional meetings. McNamara said in the first meeting the emotions were so high he thought they might come to blows. At one point, the former Vietnamese general raised his fist and shouted at McNamara. I mean, close to 1 million Vietnamese died in that war and 58,000 American soldiers were killed. That's a big loss. Of course, people will be emotional. What McNamara was doing was building a bridge, healing deep wounds, engaging in a form of reconciliation. He was reducing the stain of ugliness so that both groups, both sides could move forward and maybe even work together. Very important leadership work. Okay, I think that's enough for now. A heavy topic indeed. And one more thing in closing. The title of this video is The Ugly American. Apologies to my American friends. I'm Australian. It could well be the ugly Australian. It could be the ugly this or that. Any of us can do ugly things. Now, I should also say that while there is too much ugliness in the world today, there is also a lot of beauty, and we need to remind ourselves of that. There's a lot of good people doing incredible and beautiful things. Now, a final request. I need you to subscribe to the channel. Hit the button below. I do appreciate it, as it helps the channel to grow and to get the message out. Okay, talk to you again soon. Take care.